What's interesting about this whole idea is that I think that makes it very, very hard for them to transition to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is pure truth
Totally.
and really, really simple, right?
Yeah.
All their lies and all their BS can be pushed aside, and you can go straight to Bitcoin and outperform almost all of them.
Yep.
That, for them to admit that, is devastating to the entire industry. We're one of the biggest industries in the United States. Would be deemed irrelevant if they saw that, or if they let their customers see that.
Yeah. And I think that I don't necessarily know that equities become irrelevant per se, but I think that they changed significantly. And I do think that with the
Mm-hmm.
FABSB accounting rules changing, I think that we're going to
Mm-hmm.
see through I don't know, just self-preservation. Essentially, these corporations are going to need to start. They have to either hedge themselves against Bitcoin's potential success by having some, or they need to put some on the balance sheet in an attempt to continue to
Mm-hmm.
prolong their viability. So I think that
Absolutely. It becomes Bitcoin plus the economic value of that entity,
yeah, and
right?
it's like the great I call it the great demonetization. So all of this monetary energy that's being stored in all of these defective physical or financial instruments is going to flow into Bitcoin, and I think that's going to happen as opposed to people just selling down their real estate or selling all of their equities. I think what's going to happen is that these entities are going to start to put Bitcoin on the balance sheet, so Bitcoin is going to come through the back door in a sense, and it's going to start
Yep.
to back these things like the MicroStrategy playbook. I mean, Saylor hacked the system, man. And what he's doing, though, I think, though, is good for a lot of people call it a speculative attack on the dollar. And I don't necessarily think, and once again, I'm just a cannabis farming pleb. I could be fucking wrong about all of this, but I don't look at it as an attack per se, because he's actually strengthening the value of his business. He's utilizing the cash flows and the value of the stock to borrow, and the system has to continue to inject liquidity in the marketplace. Otherwise, we go insolvent and it's Mad Max and
Mm-hmm.
it's a major issue. And so I think that it's stabilizing the system. It's supreme collateral. It's like the debasement of the currency relative to the gold on reserve over the last 100 years until 71, where we detached entirely. I feel like
Right.
Bitcoin is pulling us back to a world where we have the dollar backed by something, and eventually, because the thing that's backing the system can be currency, wherever it is, 30 years, 50 years, 150 years from now, some politician will be like, you know what, we don't need the dollar anymore. You guys can just transact in sats, and we got
Yeah.
Lightning, we got layer threes, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I've always looked. You mean we hear that we hear government even talking at Bitcoin 2024 about revaluing gold, right? A lot of the macro analysts are talking about revaluing gold to fix the balance sheet. I mean, this is what Bitcoin is, right? It's a real
Totally.
time market, a free market, digital gold that's revaluing against the expansion of M2, right? And
Yeah.
it's just happening in real time. So putting it on the balance sheet as a reserve asset for our government, any government around the world, that it's going to immediately be that the free market version of the $1 trillion platinum coin, right?
Yeah, totally. And as the Bitcoin appreciates, someone in El Salvador is selling pupusas. They're storing that economic surplus in Bitcoin. The Saudis start selling oil for Bitcoin. If the United States government has Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset, as all of the economic activity and product efficiency and productivity gains within the marketplace hit the network, then the balance sheet, the asset that the states holds, increases in value. And I've heard smarter people than me, like Jeff Booth and Jack Mallers, talk about how in the long term, Bitcoin could appreciate at a rate and so significantly that it could eventually exceed what the U.S. debt levels are. And so I think
Right.
about that from, in my experience, or your average, individual, if they have a equity issue, if they are in a position where they don't have enough equity, if they're holding an asset that's appreciating fast enough, then they maintain the equity. They could go from a position of having negative equity, like the government has, to having equity if the assets on the balance sheet appreciate fast enough. You know, and something else that you said that it brought up a thought. So when I was selling cars in my early 20s, at that time, the internet had just really kicked off, and Edmunds.com and KBB, these websites are available. So I had very educated customers with iPhones. This is when the iPhones first came out. So they have calculators and they have printouts of the invoice for the car. They come in, they say, hey, I want this Camry or I want this Toyota Tacoma. And they're like, here's my offer. And I would go to the managers who had been in the business for 10, 20 years, and they were part of the old guard, from the old era where there wasn't this hyper rate of information spread and the access to information, and the customers weren't as well educated. And I had such a tough time. I used to have to work management harder than I would work the customers. I'm like, look, I'm telling them, I'm like, look, they got the truth. They have the invoice in their fucking hands and they have an iPhone. You're giving me this stupid Foursquare and telling them just go out there and ask them how much they can afford a month. I'm like, that's not working. I can't just be like, oh, could you pay $900 a month? The guy pulls out his iPhone and goes 900 times 72. He goes, that's $56,000. The truck's only $32,000. What's going on here? So in some sense, there's a little bit of a similar dynamic happening with Wall Street and Bitcoin, or just the financial system at large, where you have this thing that's just this exposing everything. It's like, yeah, it's providing a perspective that's crystal clear. Everything relative to this fixed unit is the value of it is now becoming clear. One of the things that I explain to people when I'm talking about Bitcoin and the economy and just the value of assets, it's, you know, we're all going through the world trying to provide value and get value in exchange and take care of our families and live some sort of a quality life. And we're making economic calculations without a constant, without a fixed unit. We're making these algebraic equations with nothing but variables because the dollar is a moving unit. So as you're trying to measure the value of something in another variable, you can't really see very clearly what's happening. And most people are kind of suffering from that optical illusion where they think their assets are going up in value. But now you can accurately solve for the value of something in the marketplace because there's a fixed unit. And that just is so revolutionary. And for me, it's been very clarifying and like recalibrating in a lot of ways. It's like, you know, Humboldt County has to come in once a year to the farm and calibrate our scale. Otherwise, the scale may not be right. Like if I put 1 pound of cannabis on that scale, if the scale hasn't been accurately calibrated, then the weight could be off. And so Bitcoin is that calibrating unit. It's recalibrating how we measure the value of everything in our world.
Dude, you just triggered something for me, right? If you think of like the scale of a weights and units measure, right? And we have dollars on here, right? We throw more dollars on, asset prices go up.
Yep.
When you are not increasing units, but you're increasing the value of each unit, which is what Bitcoin is doing, because it's the only way it can expand is by becoming more expensive, right? It's just the opposite calculation. Now everything's getting cheaper.
Yep.
And or you are forced to deliver that much more value in the goods and services you want, or that you can provide to the economy in order to get one of those Bitcoins. So it's like twofold. One, you as a Bitcoin holder are getting a higher purchasing power, but two, it's forcing the individual companies providing services and products to the market to rethink how do they deliver as much value as possible, because I'm not going to give up my Bitcoin for garbage.
So you've heard Bitcoin is the new gold rush by now. As world leaders on all sides have endorsed it as the future of money, and now you're looking to get started, we'll show you how. It's actually easier than you think. First, go to your nearest ByteFederal ATM and turn your cash to coin. ByteFederal has over 1,200 locations around the country with the highest daily limits. Go to our website, ByteFederal.com, to find the nearest ATM to you. Log in to any wallet, then create an account, deposit your US cash, and instantly convert it to Bitcoin. That's it. We are the only US manufacturer and operator in the Bitcoin ATM industry, and our US-based live customer service is second to none. Go on, give it a whirl, and don't get left behind. Click the link below.